Hello and welcome to the Luna Williams channel. I know you're here to relax, unwind, and drift into sleep while listening to tonight's story. Before you close your eyes, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment below where you're tuning in from so we can see our global community growing together. New stories are shared daily, created to calm your mind and guide you gently into rest. Now get comfortable, lower the volume, and let go of the day. Let's begin our journey into endless, resting dreams. The kingdom of Eldersfall was dying. It bled out slowly, a rot that started in the soil and crept into the souls of men. Fields that once fed a nation lay barren, choked by a creeping, gray pestilence they called the Withering. It was a magical plague, a curse that leached the color from the leaves, the warmth from the sun, and the hope from the people. The famine was a tangible beast, its claws sunk deep into the gauntlet-thin cities and hollowed-out villages. It was a kingdom ruled by a corrupt king who feasted while his subjects starved, a man who had built his throne upon a foundation of betrayal and blood. 20 years. For 20 years, the rot had spread, ever since the night the kingdom's heart had been ripped out. The night the Frostblood Guardians were slaughtered. They had been the realm's protectors, a line of powerful werewolf shifters whose very souls were twinned with the great spectral wolves of the north. They were a force of nature, their eyes the color of a winter storm, their loyalty as unyielding as the mountains from which they came. They had served the throne for centuries, an unbreakable shield. But a shield can be broken from the inside. Betrayed within the castle walls, they fell in a single night of fire and screams, their spectral wolves dissolving into moonlight and memory. All but one. A child had survived the massacre, hidden beneath the frozen bodies of his kin. That child was now a man, though the word felt too small, too tame for what he had become. His name was Luke Draven, and he was the last alpha of a dead bloodline. They called him the Wolf King without a crown. A name spat like a curse in the taverns of the capital, a name whispered in fear in the borderlands he roamed. He was a ghost story made flesh, a towering figure of scarred muscle and brutal grace. His hair was the black of a starless night, and his eyes held the same white-blue-silver glow of the guardians who came before him. He was a remnant of a better age, a walking embodiment of the kingdom's greatest shame. He was exile. He was fury. He was hunted by the very throne he was born to protect. Tonight, that fury was a physical thing, a storm raging under his skin. Luke stood on a frost-cracked precipice overlooking a valley shrouded in the gray haze of the Withering. The cold air should have soothed him, but it only seemed to fuel the fire in his veins, a fire laced with ice. He clenched his fists, the leather of his bracers groaning in protest. He could feel it, the wolf. It was not a separate entity, not a beast to be tamed. It was him. It was the rage of his slaughtered family, the agony of his loneliness, the primal instinct to hunt, to claim, to tear apart the world that had taken everything from him. And it was winning. He tore the bracer from his left arm, hissing as the frigid air hit his skin. The marks were spreading. Veins of crystalline blue, like frozen lightning, crept from his shoulder down his bicep. They were beautiful and terrifying, a lattice of frost that mirrored the spectral wolf bound to his soul. It was a physical manifestation of his curse, the one whispered in the ancient texts of his people. If the alpha fails to find his fated mate, the wolf inside him will consume the man. He was 28 years old. He had been searching since the curse had first begun to manifest at 18, a faint shimmer of ice on his shoulder. Now it had claimed most of his arm and was beginning to snake across his chest, a cold tightening around his heart. His control, once absolute, was fraying like a worn rope over a sharp edge. Every moonrise was a battle. Every transformation was more violent, the line between man and beast blurring into a gray smear of pain and instinct. A tremor racked his body, a low growl tearing from his throat, more animal than human. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the rock beside him, the stone cracking under the pressure. The world sharpened, smells becoming overwhelming. The damp earth, the distant scent of fear from a village miles away, the metallic tang of his own blood where his nails had broken the skin of his palm. His vision swam, the edges tinged with the spectral blue of his other half. Find her, the wolf snarled in the confines of his mind. It was not a plea, it was a demand. A primal, desperate command that echoed in the marrow of his bones. Find her or we die. He squeezed his eyes shut, the faces of his mother and father flashing behind his lids, their proud smiles, their hands on his shoulders, their bodies lying still in the snow. The memory was a whetstone for his rage. The man responsible for their deaths, the sorcerer King Malrek, sat on a stolen throne, growing fat and powerful on the decay of the land while Luke was reduced to this, a monster fighting himself on a forgotten cliffside. He had no pack, no family, no hope. All he had was the hunt for a woman whose face he had never seen, whose name he did not know, a mate, the other half of his soul, a concept that felt more like a fairy tale than a possibility. In a dying world, what chance was there that his one hope had even survived? The frost on his arm pulsed with a faint, cold light, and the pain intensified. It was a countdown, a clock made of ice and agony, ticking away the last vestiges of his humanity. He gritted his teeth, his jaw aching with the strain. He would not become a mindless beast. He would not let Malrek win. He would hold on, even if it tore him apart from the inside out. He pushed himself away from the rock, forcing his legs to carry him down the treacherous path. He had to keep moving. To stop was to let the wolf gain purchase, to let the frost creep closer to his heart. He was the last of the Frostblood Guardians. He was the alpha, and he would not fall. Not yet. But as he moved through the withered trees, a lone predator in a dying world, he could feel the wolf pacing just beneath the surface, its white-blue eyes watching, waiting. And for the first time in a long time, the man known as Luke Draven allowed himself to feel a sliver of true fear. Not of the king's assassins or the bounty hunters who dogged his steps. He was afraid of the night he would finally look in a reflection and see nothing of the man, only the monster. The night the wolf would not be a part of him, but all of him. The night he would be utterly and completely alone. Far from the frozen peaks and haunted forests where the Wolf King roamed, Jane Wynn lived a life of quiet order amidst chaos. She had been raised by the aging acolytes of a ruined monastery, a sanctuary of crumbling stone and resilient faith nestled in a forgotten valley. The monastery had been burned during the purges that followed the fall of Eldersfall's true rulers, but its library, miraculously, had survived. That was Jane's world, the scent of aging parchment, the silent company of forgotten lore, and the ghosts of a history she felt but could not remember. Her own history was a blank page before the age of 7. The acolytes had found her wandering near the monastery gates, small and silent, with no memory of who she was or where she came from. All she had was the name whispered in her own fevered dreams, Jane, and a strange birthmark on the inside of her right wrist. It was a delicate, intricate pattern of silver that seemed to glow with a faint, internal light in the twilight, like a captured constellation. She often hid it beneath a leather cord, unnerved by the way it seemed to hum with a life of its own. Jane was brilliant, her mind a sharp and curious thing that devoured the ancient texts in the library. But she possessed 2 gifts that no book could explain. The first was an unnerving empathy for shifters. While most of the townsfolk feared the scattered shifter clans, remnants of a proud people now treated as mongrels, Jane felt their emotions as if they were her own. She could sense their simmering anger, their deep-seated grief, their fierce loyalty. It was a constant, low thrum in the back of her mind, a language of feeling she understood better than words. Her second gift was a mystery even to her. There was a wolf pack that lived in the woods bordering the monastery. They were feral and dangerous, yet sometimes their alpha, a great black beast with a scarred muzzle, would come to the edge of the woods, its body tense, a low growl rumbling in its chest. The acolytes would hide, but Jane would simply stand in the herb garden, and a strange calm would emanate from her. The alpha's growl would soften, its posture would relax, and after a moment of staring at her with intelligent yellow eyes, it would turn and melt back into the trees. She was a human girl who could soothe the beast. Today, however, the thrum of shifter emotion was not a distant hum. It was a scream. It dragged her from the library, a visceral wave of pain, fury, and something else, something so ancient and powerful it made her bones ache. She followed the feeling and the roar of the crowd into the nearby town square. And then she saw him. He was in the center of the square, bound in heavy, rune-etched chains that sizzled against his skin, designed to suppress shifter abilities. He was on his knees, but he was not broken. He was held by a dozen brutish bounty hunters, their faces a mixture of greed and terror. His captors had clearly fought him hard. He was bruised and bleeding, his dark tunic torn, but his head was held high. He was immense, a monolith of muscle and scars that spoke of 1,000 battles. His dark hair was matted with sweat and dirt, but it was his eyes that stole the air from her lungs. They were closed, his jaw tight with strain, but Jane could feel him. She could feel the blizzard raging inside him, a storm of such magnitude it threatened to consume everything. It was the pain of 100 generations, the rage of a king betrayed. It was a power that made the local alpha wolf feel like a stray puppy. "Behold!" shouted the lead bounty hunter, a man with a piggish face and cruel eyes. "Luke Draven, the so-called Wolf King, the last of the Frostblood traitors. The king will pay a fortune for his head." A murmur of fear and awe rippled through the crowd. This was the ghost story the monster whispered about in the dark. Jane felt a tremor of fear, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming pull of his emotions. She felt his defiance, a bedrock of will that the chains and the beatings could not touch. But beneath it, she felt something else, a profound, soul-deep loneliness that mirrored the empty space in her own past. As if he could feel her gaze, his head snapped up. His eyes opened, and Jane's world stopped. They were not merely blue or silver. They were the color of a nebula, a swirling vortex of starlight and glacial ice. They glowed with an inner luminescence, the same impossible light that sometimes pulsed from the mark on her wrist. They were the stars she saw in her dreams, the ones that seemed to whisper her name from an impossible distance. In that instant, the cacophony of the square faded to a dull roar. There was only the man in chains and the invisible thread that had just been pulled taut between them. For Luke, the world had been a monochrome of pain and rage. He had been fighting the wolf, fighting the burning agony of the runes, fighting the despair that threatened to finally drag him under. Then he felt it, a sudden, inexplicable calm washing over the storm inside him. It was like a cool hand on a fevered brow, a quiet note of music in a world of clashing swords. His wolf, which had been thrashing against his mental barriers, went utterly still. It lifted its head, its senses focused on a single point in the crowd. He opened his eyes, searching for the source of this impossible peace. He found her instantly. A young woman with hair the color of autumn leaves and wide, intelligent eyes. She was not cowering like the others. She was staring at him with a look of stunned recognition, her hand clutching the leather cord on her wrist. The moment their gazes locked, a force more violent than any physical blow slammed into him. It was instinct. It was fate. It was a chemical reaction at the very core of his being. The frost marks on his arm flared with a brilliant, blinding light, the ice spreading visibly across his chest in a spiderweb of silver blue. The air around him crackled with energy. The bounty hunters stumbled back, shielding their eyes. And deep within him, in the place where man and beast were one, the wolf spoke a single word. It was not a whisper. It was a roar of triumph, of discovery, of absolute and eternal certainty. Mate. Jane gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She felt the word, even if she didn't hear it. It echoed through her, not as a sound, but as a feeling of coming home to a place she'd never known. The birthmark on her wrist burned with a fierce, silver fire, the light bleeding through her sleeve. Luke strained against his chains, every muscle in his body coiling like a steel spring. A guttural snarl ripped from his throat, a sound of pure, possessive rage. Not at her, for her. The sight of the grubby, fearful people standing so close to her, breathing her air, was an intolerable offense. He had to get to her. He had to shield her. He had to claim her. He was the last of his kind, a king with no throne, a man turning into a monster. And in the middle of his own personal hell, chained and humiliated in a squalid town square, he had just found his one and only reason to live. The chaos that erupted in the square was a blur to Jane. Luke Draven's roar had shattered the greedy bravado of the bounty hunters. The sheer, untamed power that exploded from him sent the townsfolk scattering like panicked birds. In the ensuing pandemonium, under the cover of smoke from an overturned brazier, a cloaked figure had cut the bounty hunter captain's purse, and in the fight that followed, someone, somehow, had broken the shackle lock. Luke was gone, vanished into the alleyways like a vengeful shadow. Jane had fled back to the monastery, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She couldn't shake the image of his eyes, the starlight, the agony, the raw possession in them when they'd landed on her. She couldn't ignore the searing heat from her own wrist, where the silver star, as she now thought of it, was still glowing with a residual warmth. She retreated to her sanctuary, the one place she could make sense of the world, the library. But for the first time, the familiar scent of old paper and dust offered no comfort. The encounter had unsettled something deep within her, shaking loose questions that had lain dormant for years. Who was she? Why did the most feared man in the kingdom look at her as if he'd been searching for her his entire life? Her fingers traced the raised, silvery lines of her birthmark. It had never glowed so brightly, never felt so awake. It was as if his presence had been a key turning in a lock she never knew existed. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she found herself drawn to a section of the library she rarely visited, the cold archives, a stone-walled chamber where the oldest and most fragile texts were kept. The air in here was unnaturally frigid, a permanent winter chill that had nothing to do with the season. She ran her hands along the shelves, her fingertips grazing the ancient spines. Her gift, her empathy, was usually attuned to living shifters, but in this room, she felt something else. A whisper of old magic, faint and dormant, but undeniably powerful. And it was coming from the wall behind the shelves. Her curiosity overriding her unease, she began to move the heavy oaken shelves. It took all her strength, the wood groaning in protest, but behind them she found it. Not a door, but a shallow alcove carved into the stone, an alcove that was coated in a thick layer of shimmering, untouched frost. In the center, resting on a stone pedestal, was a single scroll case, sealed not with wax but with ice. Jane reached out, her breath misting in the cold air. The moment her fingers touched the frosted case, the silver star on her wrist flared with brilliant light. The ice sealing the case didn't melt. It dissolved, turning into a fine, glittering mist that swirled around her hand before vanishing. The case clicked open. With trembling hands, she took out the scroll. It was made of a strange, resilient parchment that felt cool and smooth to the touch. As she unrolled it, glowing blue runes shimmered to life across the surface, the language of the old Frostblood Guardians. She had studied the language from other texts, but she had never seen it burn with such cold light. Her eyes scanned the elegant, sharp-edged script, and the words seemed to leap into her mind, not just read but known. The scroll told the history of the Guardians, their bond with the spectral wolves, and their sworn duty to the land. But it was the last passage, a prophecy written in a slightly different hand, that made her blood run cold. When the last Wolf King rises from the ashes of betrayal, and his Luna bears the silver star upon her wrist, their bond, forged in shadow and claimed in light, shall end the withering that steals the day and night. But heed the warning, for the choice is stark. Their union saves the world or leaves it to the dark. The wolf within him, a tempest of frost and fire, without her anchor, shall be the kingdom's funeral pyre. Jane read it once, twice, a third time. Her gaze dropped from the glowing runes to her own wrist, where the birthmark pulsed in time with her frantic heartbeat. Luna bears the silver star. It wasn't a birthmark. It was a sign, a brand of destiny. The pieces slammed together in her mind with the force of a physical blow. The Wolf King without a crowned Luke Draven, the last alpha. Her, a foundling with a glowing mark and no past. The Withering, the curse that was killing their world. It was all connected. She wasn't just some ordinary girl who could calm a feral wolf. She was a linchpin in a prophecy that would decide the fate of the entire kingdom. The scroll explained it all. Her ability to soothe his wolf wasn't a coincidence. It was the fundamental nature of their bond. She was his mate, his destined other half. The anchor meant to keep the man from being consumed by the beast. And together, their bond held the power to heal the land, or, if it failed, to destroy it completely. A wave of terror, so profound it left her breathless, crashed over her. This was not a life she wanted. She was a scholar, a quiet soul who found solace in books, not in the arms of a feared, exiled warrior king. Being his mate, his Luna, didn't just mean being part of a prophecy. It meant being a target. The same corrupt king who hunted Luke would undoubtedly hunt her, too. Malrek wouldn't just want to kill the last Frostblood. He would want to possess or destroy the key to restoring the land's magic. She had to run. The thought was pure, instinctual panic. She could flee north or east to the coast, lose herself in a city where no one knew her name. She could pretend she never saw him, never found this scroll. She could go back to being Jane Wynn, the quiet girl from the ruined monastery. She frantically rolled the scroll, shoving it back into its case. She turned to leave, her mind already plotting a path, gathering the few coins she possessed. But as she reached the doorway of the cold archives, she paused. A sudden, vivid memory of Luke's eyes flashed in her mind. She saw not the monster, but the man, the profound, aching loneliness she had sensed in him. The loneliness of a man carrying the weight of a slaughtered people, a dying world, and a curse that was eating him alive. The prophecy said he was the kingdom's pyre without her anchor. Her flight wouldn't just be an act of self-preservation, it would be a death sentence. For him, and perhaps for everyone. Fate had found her. It had a name and a face and eyes like dying stars. And Jane realized, with a new and different kind of terror, that she couldn't run from it. The wheels were already in motion. The prophecy was awake. Jane did not run. The weight of the prophecy pinned her in place, a heavier chain than any Luke had worn. For 2 days, she existed in a state of suspended fear, half expecting royal guards to storm the monastery gates. But the only thing that came was an unnerving silence. The world outside seemed to be holding its breath. On the third night, a storm rolled in, a torrent of cold rain that lashed against the monastery's stone walls. Jane was in the library, the frost-bound scroll open on the table before her, its runes casting a soft blue glow in the candlelight. She was trying to decipher the finer points, the nuances of the bond the text described when she felt it. A presence. It wasn't a sound or a shadow. It was a shift in the very air around her, a sudden charge of ozone and winter. The candle flame flickered wildly. The thrum of shifter energy she was so accustomed to was now a focused, singular hum of immense power, and it was close. Too close. She stood slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was alone in the library, the acolytes long since retired to their cells. She peered into the darkness beyond the candlelight, toward the tall, arched doorway that led outside to the cloisters. A shape emerged from the shadows, stepping silently over the threshold. Water dripped from the hem of a dark, heavy cloak, pooling on the ancient flagstones. The figure pushed back its hood. It was Luke. He was no longer the beaten captive from the square. He was clean, his dark hair damp from the rain, and he wore simple but well-made black leather armor. In the dim light, the scars that crisscrossed his face and neck seemed like dark rivers on a landscape of unforgiving stone. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his star-bright eyes fixed on her, devouring her. He looked less like a man and more like a force of nature that had decided to take human form. Jane should have screamed. She should have been terrified, but the panic she expected never came. Instead, a strange and powerful sense of calm settled over her, the same calm she inexplicably brought to him. The raging storm she could feel just beneath his skin was for the world, not for her. In his eyes, aimed at her, there was an intensity that went beyond simple anger or desire. It was obsession. It was recognition. It was the look of a starving man who had just found the only thing that could ever feed him. "You're the girl from the square," he said. His voice was a low, rough baritone, like rocks grinding together deep beneath the earth. It was not a question. Jane could only nod, her throat suddenly dry. He took a step into the room, and another. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and deliberate. He wasn't threatening her, yet every cell in her body was aware of him, of the sheer power he held in check. He was her silent shadow, materialized from the night. The wolf inside him, she could feel, was straining at its leash, not with rage, but with a desperate, possessive need. It wanted to close the distance, to scent her, to touch her, to ensure she was real. "They will come for you," he stated, his gaze flickering to the scroll on the table, then back to her. "Malrek's men, they know I was captured here. They will search for anyone who might have helped me." It wasn't a warning, it was a reason. An excuse to be here, to stand in her presence. "I didn't help you," she whispered, finding her voice. "You did," he countered, his eyes boring into hers. "You were there, that was enough." He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold magic the prophecy spoke of. He was not gentle. He was not soft. He was the end of a bloodline, a man haunted by ghosts and hunted by monsters. And she was, for some reason he was only beginning to understand, the only thing keeping him from becoming one himself. The wolf inside him would slaughter armies to keep her safe. It would burn the world down to protect her. The man just hadn't figured out how to explain that yet, but Jane was not afraid of him. And that was the strangest thing of all. His presence, as overwhelming as it was, felt familiar. Like a half-remembered dream or a song she'd once known the words to. It felt like a memory. She looked at him, truly looked past the warrior and the wolf king, and saw the flicker of vulnerability in his gaze. He was as lost as she was. "Why do I feel like I know you?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Luke's expression shifted. The hard lines of his face softened for a fraction of a second. A flicker of confusion, of a deep, ancient pain, crossed his features. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. But as he looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes and the silver star now glowing openly on her wrist, a memory broke through the haze of 20 years of rage and grief. It wasn't a clear image, but a cascade of sensations. The biting cold of snow, the searing pain of a wound in his side, the scent of pine and wood smoke, and a small hand, so small, pressing a piece of cloth against his fur. He had been a boy of 8, newly shifted, still clumsy in his wolf form. He had been playing in the woods near the capital when Malrek's first assassins came for his family. He'd been struck by a poisoned arrow and left for dead. He had dragged himself through the snow for what felt like miles, collapsing near a burned-out building. He was dying. And then she had found him. A little girl with autumn hair and serious eyes, no older than 7. She wasn't afraid of the blood or of the great white wolf cub whimpering in the snow. She had torn a piece of her own cloak and pressed it to his wound, her small presence a beacon of impossible warmth in the freezing cold. She had saved his life. His family's guards found him there hours later, the girl long gone, but the scent of her, his fated mate, had been burned into his soul. His father, the Alpha, had found the girl's family. He had known instantly what she was to Luke. To protect her from Malrek, who would have used her as a pawn against them, they had made a terrible choice. A court sorceress had wiped her memory, not just of Luke, but of everything before that day. She was then given to the acolytes of the monastery, a place they believed would be safe, a place no one would ever look for a girl connected to the Frostblood Guardians. "The snow," Luke whispered, the words ragged. You found me in the snow." Jane's eyes widened. A fragmented image flashed through her mind, a flash of white fur, the shocking crimson of blood against snow, and a pair of terrified, beautiful white-blue-silver eyes. It was a dream she'd had 1,000 times, one she'd always dismissed as a fantasy. "The wolf cub," she breathed, her hand rising to her mouth. It wasn't a dream, it was a memory. Their connection wasn't just prophecy, it wasn't just fate, it was history. A history stolen from her, a bond forged when they were children. He had been her wounded wolf. She had been his small, fearless savior. And their story had been waiting 2 decades to be remembered. In the heart of Eldersfall's capital, the royal castle stood like a black fang against a perpetually gray sky. It was a place of suffocating opulence and chilling silence, its corridors draped in finery that couldn't conceal the decay underneath. Here, on a throne carved from petrified weirwood, sat the architect of the kingdom's suffering, Sorcerer King Malrek. Malrek was not a man who commanded respect through strength, but one who cultivated fear through cruelty. He was unnaturally pale, his skin stretched thin over sharp bones, and his eyes were the flat, dead black of obsidian chips. He wore robes of embroidered silk, but no amount of wealth could hide the grasping ambition that had driven him to murder his king and the king's most loyal protectors. He stood now in his private laboratory, a chamber high in the castle's spire, far from the prying eyes of his court. The air was thick with the cloying scent of alchemical reagents and something else, something metallic and foul. In the center of the room, a large, black scrying pool swirled with noxious-looking liquid. "Show me," Malrek commanded, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He sprinkled a pinch of gray powder, dust gathered from a withered field, into the pool. The liquid churned and an image formed on its dark surface. It showed a blighted forest, the trees skeletal and leafless, the ground a carpet of gray moss. The Withering, his great work. Most believed it a natural plague, a curse from the gods. Only Malrek knew the truth. The Withering was not a blight on the land, it was a siphoning. Every dead leaf, every barren field was a bit of life force, a trickle of magic, being drawn from the earth and funneled directly to him. It fueled his power, extending his life, but it was a slow and inefficient process. He was merely drinking from a stream when he wanted to command an ocean. "It is not enough," he hissed to the empty room. "The land's magic fights back. It is weak, but it resists." His plan, conceived 20 years ago, had been simple: eradicate the Frostblood Guardians. They were intrinsically linked to the health of the land. Their life force was the land's life force. By killing them, he had dealt the kingdom a mortal wound, one from which he could feed for decades. He had thought he'd succeeded completely. He had killed the Alpha, his mate, and, he believed, their only son. But the boy had survived. Luke Draven was a loose thread, a flaw in his perfect tapestry of betrayal. For years, Malrek had sent assassins and bounty hunters after him, but the Wolf King was as elusive and dangerous as a winter storm. A nuisance, but one Malrek believed he could manage. Until now. He gestured to the scrying pool again. "Show me the boy, show me the last of the wolves." The image shifted. It showed the town square, the bounty hunters, the chains. Malrek smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. But his smile faded as he watched the scene unfold. He saw the girl in the crowd. He saw the way Draven's eyes locked onto her. He saw the impossible explosion of power, the frost marks on the Alpha's skin flaring with a light that made the magic in his own veins recoil. "No," Malrek whispered, his obsidian eyes widening. He leaned closer, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the pool. The image zoomed in on the girl, on the unmistakable glow of the silver star on her wrist. It cannot be. The Luna. The ancient prophecies were texts he had studied and dismissed as folklore, sentimental nonsense. When the last Wolf King rises, and his Luna bears the silver star, their bond shall end the Withering. End it? No, their bond would reignite it. The union of the Alpha and the Luna would not just heal the land. It would create a font of primordial magic, a torrent of power that would make his siphoning look like a child's parlor trick. Luke Draven was no longer a nuisance. He was a mortal threat to Malrek's reign, and the girl, Jane Wynn, his spies had already brought him her name, was the key. "She is the catalyst," Malrek mused, a cold fire igniting in his dead eyes. He had assumed he needed to kill the last Frostblood to secure his power. He had been thinking too small. Why destroy a source of power when you could claim it for yourself? His plan sharpened, crystallizing in his mind. He would not simply kill Luke and the girl. He would capture her. He would use dark alchemy and forbidden rituals to sever her bond to the wolf and forcibly bind her to him. He would become the anchor for that power. And as for Luke, a wolf whose mate has been stolen and broken is a wolf that will lose its mind. He would be transformed into a mindless, raging beast, a perfect weapon to unleash upon his own people before being put down. But that was not enough. To truly cement his power and erase the Frostblood legacy forever, he needed a replacement. He moved to an iron-bound chest in the corner of the room and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a gnarled, pulsating object that looked like a petrified heart. It was the heart of Fenris, a demonic artifact he had spent years searching for. "The time is coming," he whispered to the artifact. With the power he would steal from the Luna, he could use the heart to summon a demon wolf, a creature of pure shadow and hunger. He would bind it to his most loyal shifters, creating his own army of corrupted, monstrous guardians. They would not protect the land, they would devour it at his command. Malrek straightened up, a renewed sense of purpose radiating from him. The game had changed. The stakes were higher, the potential reward infinitely greater. He would finish what he started 20 years ago. He would destroy the last Wolf King, capture the Silver Star Luna, break their bond, and claim their power for himself. He would not just rule a dying kingdom. He would become a god, with an army of monsters at his back and the very life force of the world as his crown. The world beyond the monastery walls was a study in gray. Luke and Jane traveled north, towards the frozen spine of the mountains where the ruins of his ancestral home, Frostfang Keep, lay hidden. It was the only place he knew that was shielded by ancient wards, the only place they might be safe from Malrek's scrying eyes. Their journey was a silent pilgrimage through a dying land. They moved through skeletal forests where the trees clawed at the sky like bony fingers, and they passed through villages hollowed out by famine and the Withering. The faces of the people they saw were gaunt and hopeless, their eyes reflecting the same gray as the blighted fields around them. For Jane, it was a brutal education. She had been sheltered in her valley, aware of the kingdom's sickness, but shielded from its worst symptoms. Now she saw it, felt it, breathed it in. The prophecy was no longer an abstract concept on a scroll. It was the hollow-eyed stare of a starving child. Luke moved through this landscape as if he were a part of it, a grim, silent specter of vengeance. He did not know how to be gentle, how to offer easy comfort. His protection was a harsh and practical thing. He taught her how to track, how to find clean water, how to move without a sound. He showed her which plants were safe to eat and which were touched by the blight. His lessons were short, his voice clipped and impatient, but his eyes never left her. He was a constant, brooding presence at her side, a shield between her and the world. The wolf inside him was a constant battle. Being so close to her, his mate, was both a balm and a torment. Her presence soothed the ragged edges of his control, keeping the beast from overwhelming him. But it also ignited a possessive, primal fire that was almost as difficult to manage as the rage. Every instinct screamed at him to claim her, to mark her, to bind her to him so completely that nothing could ever threaten her again. He fought it down, mistaking the raw, ancient drive of the mate bond for the monster he was so terrified of becoming. He kept a careful distance, his body tense, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Jane, in turn, did not know how to be claimed. She had spent her life in solitude, independent and self-reliant. Luke's suffocating protectiveness chafed at her, even as a part of her, a part that was waking to her Luna instincts, found a strange comfort in it. She saw the war he fought within himself, felt the violent tempest of his emotions. She saw him one night, standing watch while she rested, his body shaking with the strain of holding his shift at bay. The frost marks on his arms were glowing, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Without thinking, she went to him and placed her hand on his arm, right over the spreading ice. He flinched, his whole body going rigid. "Don't," he rasped, his voice tight with strain. But she didn't pull away. Through her palm, she felt the chaotic energy inside him, a blizzard of pain and power. She focused on the memory of the wolf cub in the snow, on the feeling of calm she had always been able to project. She pushed that feeling into him, a silent offering of peace. Slowly, miraculously, the tremor in his body subsided. The fierce blue glow of the frost marks softened to a gentle pulse. The growl died in his throat, replaced by the ragged sound of his breathing. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her, his star-bright eyes wide with a raw, painful vulnerability. In that moment, he wasn't the Wolf King. He was just Luke, a man carrying an impossible burden. "How do you do that?" he whispered. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I just do." Their bond was deepening with every shared meal, every silent watch, every step they took together. It was not a soft or gentle thing. It was a current of wild magic flowing between them, at times tender, at times fiery. They argued over which path to take, his grim pragmatism clashing with her scholarly knowledge of old maps. The arguments were sharp and fierce, crackling with an unspoken tension that had nothing to do with their direction. One evening, sheltering from the rain in a shepherd's abandoned hut, the tension finally broke. "You treat me like a child, like a piece of glass that might shatter." She burst out, her frustration boiling over. "I am not weak, Luke." "I never said you were," he growled, turning to face her in the cramped space. The firelight danced on his scarred features, making him look more dangerous than ever. "I treat you like you're the only thing in this rotting world that matters, because you are." "That's not a burden I asked for. You think I asked for this?" He shot back, taking a step closer, crowding her against the rough-hewn wall. The air was thick with the scent of rain, wood smoke, and him. "To have my entire sanity tethered to a woman I've just met. To feel every moment like my skin is on fire if I'm not close enough to you. To know that the wolf inside me would rather kill me than let anything harm you." His face was inches from hers, his chest rising and falling with the force of his words. Jane's anger evaporated, replaced by a dizzying rush of feeling. She saw the truth of his words in the depths of his eyes, the obsession, the fear, the all-consuming need. He didn't know how to love softly. He only knew how to possess, to protect, to claim. And fate, it seemed, knew exactly what it was doing. Before she could think, before she could hesitate, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a spark of lightning in the dark. For a moment, he was completely still, shocked into inaction. Then, a shudder ran through his massive frame, and he groaned, a sound of pure, helpless surrender. His hands came up to cradle her face, his touch surprisingly careful, as if he were holding the most precious, fragile thing in existence. He kissed her back with a desperate, starved hunger that stole her breath and set her blood on fire. It was a kiss of prophecy and memory, of two broken halves finding their whole. It was not peaceful. It was not calm. It was inevitable. And in the heart of a dying kingdom, under the sound of the rain, their love finally began to unfold. They were less than a day's journey from Frostfang Keep when the world fell apart. They were moving through a narrow, rocky pass when the air grew unnaturally cold, and a thick, cloying fog rolled in, smelling of decay and dark magic. Jane felt a wave of such malevolent power that it made her gasp and stumble. Before Luke could react, figures emerged from the mist. They were shifters, but wrong. Their eyes glowed with a sickly green light, their movements jerky and unnatural, their bodies adorned with black iron armor etched with corrupting runes. Malrek's corrupted guardians. Luke shoved Jane behind him, a snarl ripping from his throat that was purely wolf. "Run!" he commanded, his voice a guttural roar. But there was nowhere to run. They were surrounded. A figure strode through the ranks of the corrupted shifters, his pale robes seeming to absorb the light. It was Malrek. He held a black, obsidian orb in his hand, and it pulsed with a sickening rhythm. "Luke Draven," Malrek said, his voice a dry whisper that carried with unnatural clarity. "How fitting to find you in the dirt, just like the rest of your family." Luke launched himself forward, a blur of motion, but Malrek simply smiled. The corrupted shifters swarmed Luke, their numbers overwhelming. As Luke fought, a whirlwind of claws and fury, Jane saw Malrek raise the orb. A beam of black energy shot from it, not at Luke, but at her. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, frozen. The energy wrapped around her like shadowy tendrils, and her world dissolved into darkness. When she awoke, she was chained to a stone altar in the center of a vast, circular chamber. The ceiling was open to the sky, and a full moon, tinged blood-red, hung directly overhead. Malrek stood before her, chanting in a language that made her teeth ache. Runes carved into the floor around the altar began to glow with the same sickly green light as his soldiers' eyes. This was his ritual site, the heart of his power. "The blood moon is at its apex," Malrek said, his black eyes glittering. "Perfect for severing a bond of the moon's making. Once you are untethered from him, your power will be mine, you will be my anchor." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Jane. She struggled against her chains, but they were coated in the same magic that held her immobile. She could feel Luke. He was close. She could feel his boundless, apocalyptic rage as he fought his way to her. And then he was there. Luke burst into the chamber, a force of primal destruction. He was bloodied and battered, but his eyes were blazing furnaces of white-blue fire. The remaining corrupted guards threw themselves at him, and he tore through them, no longer a man fighting, but a beast of vengeance. He was almost to the altar when Malrek finished his incantation. The sorcerer slammed his hand onto a rune on the altar's edge. Too late, Wolf King, he shrieked. A column of searing green energy erupted from the floor, engulfing Jane. She screamed as she felt a profound tearing sensation deep within her soul, as if the thread connecting her to Luke was being ripped apart. Across the chamber, Luke roared in agony. He staggered, clutching his chest, his eyes flickering wildly. The frost marks covering his body flared violently, no longer controlled but erupting across his skin, encasing him in a jagged shell of ice. His human features distorted, his bones cracking and reshaping. The wolf, driven mad by the severing of the bond, was taking over, completely. He threw his head back and howled, a sound of such utter loss and fury that the very stones of the chamber trembled. He had become what he most feared, a mindless beast, his eyes glowing with feral, untempered power. He was no longer Luke. He was only the wolf. Malrek laughed, a high, triumphant sound. "Behold your savior, a monster as I always said he was." The beast that was once Luke turned its burning eyes on Malrek, a low, deathly growl rumbling in its chest. It gathered itself to pounce, to tear the sorcerer limb from limb. This was it, the prophecy's dark path, the kingdom's funeral pyre. But then, from the altar, Jane found a final ounce of strength. The green energy was tearing her apart, but the bond, though savaged, was not yet broken. She reached for it for him. She didn't use magic. She didn't use the power of the silver star. She used love. She pushed a memory through the fraying bond, the image of a small, white wolf cub bleeding in the snow. She sent the feeling of her small hand on his fur, the warmth she had offered him, the complete absence of fear. She called his name, not with her voice, but with her soul. Luke. The beast froze mid-spring. Its head snapped toward her. The feral light in its eyes flickered. A shred of consciousness of the man was still there, fighting to the surface. "Luke, come back to me," her soul cried out. "I am here. I am your anchor." Malrek watched in horror as something impossible happened. The monster was hesitating. And in that moment of hesitation, the bond between Luke and Jane, which Malrek had tried to sever, did something else entirely. It snapped back into place, not as it was, but 1,000 times stronger. It completed. A wave of incandescent power exploded from them both. It was not just frost. It was not just the magic of the silver star. It was something new, frostfire. A torrent of brilliant, silver-blue energy that was both freezing cold and searingly hot. It slammed into Malrek, who screamed as the pure, untainted magic of the land scoured him from existence, leaving nothing but a pile of ash and the faint smell of ozone. The corrupting runes on the floor shattered. The corrupted shifters collapsed, the evil magic leaving their bodies. The wave of frostfire washed out from the chamber, across the dying kingdom. Where it passed, the Withering dissolved. Gray leaves turned green. Barren fields grew lush. The color and life of the world returned in a single, breathtaking heartbeat. In the center of the chamber, the energy subsided. Luke stood where the beast had been, no longer fighting his transformation, but in perfect harmony with it. He was taller, broader, his features sharper, no longer just a man, but something more. The frost marks on his skin were no longer a curse, but intricate, beautiful markings of power. He was the true Wolf King, reborn. The chains on Jane's wrists had melted away. The silver star on her wrist glowed with a steady, powerful light. She was the Luna of prophecy, fully realized. Luke knelt by the altar, gathering her into his arms. And as he held her, the air behind him shimmered. A colossal, spectral wolf, its fur like moonlight and its eyes the color of their shared soul, materialized. It was no longer just his second soul, a spirit visible only to him. It was real, a guardian made manifest for all to see. The lost bloodline had returned, and the kingdom had been saved. The dawn that broke over Eldersfall was one the people had not seen in 20 years. The sun was not a pale, hazy disk in a gray sky, but a brilliant orb of gold, its rays washing over a land reborn. The Withering was gone. From the capital to the farthest borderlands, the world was awash in vibrant greens and rich, earthy browns. Magic, clean and wild, sang in the air once more. News of Malrek's fall and the miracle of the land's healing spread like wildfire. Delegations of lords, village elders, and even the scattered shifter clans made the pilgrimage to the ruins of Frostfang Keep, where Luke and Jane had made their temporary home. They came to see the proof with their own eyes. The Wolf King, radiating an aura of calm, immense power, and the Luna at his side, her presence a tangible comfort. Most of all, they came to see the great spectral guardian, the massive wolf spirit that now padded silently at Luke's side, a visible and breathtaking symbol of the restored bloodline. They came in fear and left in awe. They knelt. They knelt before the man they had once called a traitor, the last son of the family their apathy had allowed to be slaughtered. They knelt before the king who had saved them not with armies or edicts, but with the strength of a bond they could barely comprehend. The corrupt lords who had supported Malrek offered their fealty out of terror. The common folk offered theirs out of genuine, tearful gratitude. The throne, abdicated by fear and corruption, was his. Weeks later, in the grand library of the royal castle, now cleansed of Malrek's dark influence, Jane found a quiet moment, the first she'd had since their lives had been upended. Luke was in the throne room, dealing with the endless petitions and logistical nightmares of rebuilding a kingdom. But here, surrounded by books, she felt a semblance of her old self. She had the frost-bound scroll, their prophecy, laid out on a large oak table. She was no longer trying to understand it, but to preserve it, to document its fulfillment for future generations. Her fingers traced the elegant, glowing runes, a faint smile on her lips. They had done it. They had faced the darkness and won. Her eyes drifted to the bottom of the scroll, to a section of text that had been obscured by a fold in the ancient parchment. It was a single line, written in the same hand as the main prophecy, almost as an afterthought or a final, solemn addendum. Curious, she carefully flattened the brittle edge. New runes, previously hidden, glowed into life. Peace lasts only as long as the Wolf King's heart remains whole. Jane frowned, reading the line again. It seemed simple enough, a poetic closing. But the old instincts of the scholar, the seeker of hidden meanings, stirred within her. The prophecies of the Frostbloods were never merely poetic. Every word had weight. The Wolf King's heart remains whole. Her breath caught in her throat. His heart wasn't just the muscle in his chest. The prophecy wasn't talking about his physical health. In the lore, in the very nature of their bond, she was his heart. The anchor, the other half of his soul. The implication crashed down on her with the weight of a mountain. The wave of frostfire magic that had healed the land, the power that now kept the world in balance, was a direct manifestation of their completed bond. It was sustained by their union. If their bond were to break, if something were to happen to her, if she were to die, the magic would not just fade. It would shatter. The power that had healed the world could just as easily unmake it. The wolf that was now in perfect balance with the man would be unleashed once more. But this time, it would be a creature broken by a grief so absolute it would feel like the end of the world. And it would have the power to make it so. The library doors opened, and Luke entered, his broad shoulders filling the archway. He had shed his heavy armor for a simple black tunic that did little to conceal his formidable strength. The weight of the crown he now unofficially wore was already settling on him, but his face softened the moment he saw her. The great spectral wolf padded silently behind him, its silver eyes regarding Jane with serene affection before it lay down by the hearth. "The council can squabble over grain shipments for one more hour," he said, his voice a low rumble. He crossed the room, his eyes only for her. "I needed to see you." He came to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders, his presence a comforting weight. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to the side of her neck, inhaling her scent. It was a simple, possessive gesture he did 100 times a day, a constant reassurance that she was here, that she was real, that she was his. "What is it?" He asked, sensing the tension in her. "What have you found?" She looked from the final, terrible line of the prophecy to the man she loved. She saw the peace in his eyes, a peace he had never known before, a peace she had given him. She understood, then, the true nature of her destiny. She was not just his queen or his mate. She was the custodian of his soul, and by extension, the guardian of the world's fragile new peace. She chose not to tell him, not yet. He had carried the weight of a curse for a decade. She would not place the weight of this new, more terrible prophecy upon him now. She reached up, placing her hand over his. "Just an old story," she said softly, forcing a smile. "It's already over." Luke turned her in his arms, his gaze intense, searching. He didn't believe her, not entirely, but he saw the love in her eyes and chose to trust it. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. "It's not over," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that was equal parts love and a dark, primal possessiveness. "It's just beginning." He was the world's savior, the Wolf King who had brought back the sun, but she knew a truth that no one else did. The fate of Eldersfall no longer rested on his shoulders, but in the steady beat of her own heart. If she died, he would not just lose the world. He would become the one to end it. And as he held her, his arms a cage of unyielding strength, Jane knew their story was far from over. It had simply found new, more terrifying stakes.